The document they couldn't translate wasn't long. That was the first thing Archivist 17th of Culmination noted when the human delegation slid it across the obsidian table. 3 pages, unbound, the edges slightly uneven, as though cut by hand rather than machine. The paper itself was wrong, too thick, too warm, made from compressed plant fiber the way civilizations made things before they understood better materials existed. And in the upper right corner of the first page, someone had pressed a thumbprint in what the chemical sensors confirmed was human blood. Not a signature, not a stamp, a thumbprint. 17th stared at it for 4 seconds before the human woman sitting across the table spoke. "We call it a covenant," she said. "In our older traditions, it means the words inside are worth dying for." 17th said nothing. Around the chamber, 11 other senior delegates from 6 Galactic Empire species shifted in their seats. The silence stretched. No one laughed, but several of them wanted to. The Galactic Empire had been watching humanity for 63 of their years before making formal contact. 63 years of observation, cataloging, quiet anthropological debate. The dominant question among xenosociologists was never whether humanity would survive long enough to achieve interstellar travel. The dominant question was always which asterisk of their self-destructive tendencies would end them first. War was the leading candidate. Economics was a close second. A minority faction argued it would be something stranger, something uniquely human, something that didn't have a clean category in imperial taxonomies. They turned out to be right, though not in any way they had predicted. The Empire made contact 14 months ago. The humans reacted with what the Empire's sociologists classified as statistically normal first contact behavior: panic, denial, religious upheaval, political fracture, and then, faster than any species on record, a kind of ferocious, almost aggressive asterisk hope. That last part had been unexpected. Most species, upon learning they were not alone, spent considerable time processing their smallness. Humans processed it for approximately 11 days before several of their governments began drafting diplomatic frameworks. 11 days. The Empire's own first contact protocols had been written over the course of 200 years. "They're moving quickly because they're frightened," said Senior Consul Marin of the Unbroken Line, who oversaw the contact mission. She was of the Vathai, tall, four-armed, with a crest that shifted color based on emotional state. Her crest had been a calm, confident amber since the mission began. Fast movement is a fear response. They think if they can establish formal relations quickly, they'll be protected. "Protected from what?" asked 17th. "From us," Marin said simply. That assessment had shaped the Empire's entire approach to the negotiations. The humans were afraid. The humans were small. The humans had one inhabited world, a single space station they were enormously proud of, and military technology roughly 3 centuries behind imperial standard. They were not a threat. They were not a curiosity. They were, in the careful language of imperial classification, a asterisk developing species of moderate long-term potential. Which meant the negotiations were essentially a formality. The Empire would offer a standard provisional protectorate agreement. The humans would sign it. They would receive limited trade access, technological exchange at a managed pace to prevent societal disruption, and the quiet understanding that imperial law now superseded human law in any matter touching interstellar affairs. It was generous, by imperial standards. Most species in humanity's position were simply absorbed without consultation. Marin had expected the humans to be grateful. She had not expected the woman with the bloodstained document. Her name was Ambassador Elena Vasquez, and she had been chosen by a coalition of Earth's governments through a process the Empire's analysts found baffling. Not because the process was corrupt, it wasn't. Not because she was unqualified, she wasn't. It was baffling because she had been selected specifically because she had already failed. 12 years earlier, Elena Vasquez had led Earth's most ambitious international climate negotiation. It had collapsed, publicly, visibly, catastrophically collapsed, 3 years of work dissolving in a single session when the largest polluting nations walked out simultaneously. The footage of Vasquez standing at the empty table afterward, not crying, not speaking, simply standing there with her hands flat on the surface as though she needed to feel something solid, had been broadcast everywhere. Then she had gone back to work. Why her? Imperial analysts had asked their human informants. Because she knows what it costs, one informant said, and she came back anyway. That answer had not resolved the analysts' confusion. It had deepened it. Vasquez arrived at the negotiating station, a neutral platform the Empire had constructed at the edge of the Sol system as a concession to human comfort, with a team of 4. Her deputy, a former military officer named Marcus Acaffer, who walked with the careful deliberateness of someone managing chronic pain, a linguist, a historian, and a doctor. The Empire's delegation found the doctor's inclusion puzzling. They filed it as a quirk. Humans were medically fragile by galactic standards. It was perhaps a precaution. They were wrong about what the doctor was for. They wouldn't understand that for a very long time. The first session began with the Empire presenting the Provisional Protectorate Agreement in its standard form. It was, in 17th's estimation, a beautiful document, 500 years of refined diplomatic language, every clause load-bearing, every exception carefully mapped, a masterpiece of institutional civilization. Vasquez read all 600 pages of it overnight. When she returned the next morning, she set it aside. "We're not signing this," she said. The room temperature seemed to drop. Marin's crest flickered from amber toward a deep, cautious blue. "Ambassador," Marin said carefully, "you understand what this agreement represents. Access, protection, integration into the largest cooperative civilization in this region of the galaxy." "I understand what it represents to you," Vasquez said. "What it represents to us is a ceiling. You've capped our technological exchange at a rate that keeps us 3 centuries behind you indefinitely. You've defined our legal sovereignty as conditional on imperial approval. You've included an emergency intervention clause that lets you place military assets in our system without our consent if you determine we pose an instability risk." She paused. "Who defines instability?" "The Imperial Council, which has no human members." Silence. "This isn't a protection agreement," Vasquez said. "It's a very polite cage, and we've had enough experience with polite cages to recognize them quickly." 17th glanced at Marin. Marin's crest was now the deep blue of careful recalibration. After the session ended, Marin filed an updated assessment. "The humans are not moving quickly because they are frightened," she wrote. "They are moving quickly because they are angry. Adjust framework accordingly." But she still did not believe they were dangerous. That misclassification would cost the Empire something it hadn't expected to lose. The negotiations moved into their second week. Vasquez presented a counter-proposal. The Empire's analysts spent 6 hours reviewing it, and then spent another 2 hours trying to determine if something had been lost in translation. It hadn't. The humans were proposing full mutual sovereignty recognition, unrestricted technological exchange, a joint governance council with weighted but genuine human representation, and removal of the intervention clause entirely. "They're not negotiating," said Delegate Prime Orison, who calculates, a Dravathi economist whose species had never lost a trade negotiation in 400 years. "They're writing a wish list." "They're establishing a position," 17th said slowly. Something about the document was bothering him. He couldn't identify it yet. "A position they have no leverage to hold." "No military leverage," 17th agreed. Orison's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a Dravathi expression of total incomprehension. "What other kind is there?" 17th didn't answer. He was reading the counterproposal again. Specifically, he was reading the preamble, which none of the other analysts had paid attention to because preambles were ceremonial, decorative, legally weightless. The preamble of the human document began with a single sentence: "We have been here before." And then it listed dates. 47 dates, spanning 400 years of human history. 17th ran them through the Imperial Historical Database and found no correlating events. The database, of course, only contained human history from the Empire's 63 years of observation. He made a note to investigate the dates. He forgot about it for 11 days because other things required attention. That was the second mistake. By the third week, the Empire's delegation had made a decision. They would wait the humans out. This was standard practice for protracted first contact negotiations. Developing species always arrived at the table with inflated expectations. Given time, exposure to imperial scale, and gentle reminders of their own vulnerability, they inevitably recalibrated toward realism. "How long do they have?" Orison asked, meaning, how long until Earth's coalition governments fractured under the pressure of having no agreement? "Our models suggest 6 to 10 weeks before significant domestic political pressure forces them to accept terms closer to our original proposal," said the analyst running projections. "They have factions at home arguing for immediate acceptance of anything we offer. Those factions will grow. Then we wait." What the Empire's models had not accounted for, Vasquez knew the models existed. Not specifically, she couldn't have known the Empire's exact projection methodology, but she knew something like them existed because this was what powerful parties did. She had been in negotiations before. She knew how waiting was weaponized. She had a plan for it. On day 22, Vasquez requested a procedural pause. This was normal. Both sides had used procedural pauses before. The Empire's delegation used them to file reports. Vasquez, the Empire assumed, was using them to communicate with Earth. But she was also doing something else. On day 23, a signal was transmitted from the human delegation's communications array. The Empire's monitoring systems flagged it, analyzed it, and determined it was encrypted personal correspondence. Common, unremarkable, not a security concern. They didn't break the encryption because they had decided to perform this negotiation without active surveillance of the human team's private communications. It was an ethical stance, part of the Empire's self-image as a civilization that operated with integrity. That ethical stance was about to become extremely relevant. Day 28. Vasquez walked back into the negotiating chamber, and something had changed. 17th noticed it first, because it was his function to notice things. It wasn't her posture. She carried herself the same way she always had, with that particular human quality he'd come to think of as controlled heaviness, as though every step was a decision. It wasn't her expression. It wasn't her words. It was Marcus Ackefer. The deputy had always managed his pain visibly, the careful gait, the way he lowered himself into chairs with a controlled precision that spoke of old injuries. Today he moved differently. Not better, differently, as though the pain had shifted location or changed character. And the doctor, who usually sat along the wall behind the human delegation, was sitting at the table today. "We have an update to share before we continue," Vasquez said. "Ambassador." "It won't take long." She nodded to the linguist who activated a display. 31 days ago, in anticipation of these negotiations, Earth's global coalition authorized a contingency program. I want to be transparent about that program now. Marin's crest shifted. "What program?" "We call it the Covenant Preparation Initiative." Vasquez let that sit for exactly 1 second. 17,000 humans have volunteered to undergo a specific preparation process. The first phase completed 4 days ago. Preparation for what? 17th asked. For the possibility that these negotiations fail. She met his eyes directly, a human behavior that still struck most Imperial delegates as slightly aggressive. We aren't certain they will fail. We hope they won't, but we believe in preparing for outcomes we don't want. The room was very quiet. What does this preparation involve? Marin asked carefully. Vasquez turned to her doctor, Dr. Amara Singh, who pulled up a medical schematic on the display. 17th looked at it. He didn't understand what he was seeing at first. Then he did. And the room stopped being quiet in a completely different way. Here was what the Empire had misunderstood about the thumbprint on the first page of the human document. They had interpreted it as symbolic, a cultural artifact, a dramatic gesture. Humans were known for dramatic gestures. The blood was metaphorical intent made tactile. It meant we are serious, which every diplomat at every table always claimed to mean. They had not considered the possibility that it was asterisk literal. The Covenant Preparation Initiative was, in the most direct terms 17th could find in any of his 4 working languages, a program in which human volunteers were being systematically modified to survive conditions that would otherwise kill them. Not enhanced, not in the way the Empire understood enhancement. The modifications were specifically, deliberately, narrowly targeted: pain tolerance, cellular repair rates, cognitive function under oxygen deprivation, resistance to pressure changes. None of it made them stronger in any conventional military sense. All of it made them harder to stop once they'd started moving. Why? Marin asked, and for the first time in 17th's experience, her voice carried something he would have called bewilderment. If negotiations fail, you would face Imperial military response. These modifications wouldn't help us win, Vasquez agreed immediately. We know that. We're not preparing to win a war with you. Then what are you preparing for? To make the war expensive enough that starting it stops being worth it. Vasquez leaned forward slightly. We've done the math. We can't defeat you militarily. We've known that since first contact. What we can do is ensure that pacifying us costs you more than you ever expected to pay. Every system you'd need to hold. Every planet you'd need to garrison. 17,000 people who are considerably harder to stop than a standard human. And behind them, billions more who watched what we did to those 17,000 and decided to sign up for the next phase. Orison made a sound that had no translation. You're describing, Marin said slowly, a doctrine of making yourself a problem too costly to solve. I'm describing the only leverage available to a species that can't outgun you. Vasquez sat back. We've done this before, not with alien empires, with each other. It's not our best feature, but it is a real one. The dates in the preamble. 17th suddenly, finally, understood what they were. Every time a smaller human nation had made itself too costly for a larger one to absorb cleanly, every insurgency, every guerrilla campaign, every occupation that had bled its occupier until withdrawal became politically necessary. 47 examples spanning 400 years. The preamble wasn't ceremonial. It was a history lesson. It was evidence. The negotiations did not end that day. They got worse. Marin requested a 48-hour recess and spent it in emergency consultation with the Imperial Council, which was 40 light minutes away, and therefore required a highly frustrating conversation conducted in statements rather than exchanges. The Council's initial response was dismissive. 17,000 modified humans were not a military threat to an empire spanning 400 systems. The doctrine Vasquez had described was a rational deterrent strategy, yes, but deterrent strategies required a genuine capacity to impose unacceptable costs, and humanity simply didn't have that capacity. Run the models again, Marin said. Not the military models, the asterisk occupation asterisk models. There was a delay of 80 minutes before the council responded. The occupation models, it turned out, had not been run. There had been no reason to run them. Humanity was a developing species of moderate long-term potential. The models assumed rapid capitulation following a standard military demonstration of force. The models assumed humans would stop. "They won't stop," 17th said quietly, when Marin read him the council's analysis. He'd been reading human history for 11 days straight by this point, working through every major archive Vasquez's linguist had provided as supporting documentation for the human counterproposal. Material he had initially skimmed because it seemed like diplomatic filler. Consul, their history has no examples, none, of a complete civilizational surrender following military defeat alone. Every occupation eventually faced resistance. Every imposed peace eventually fractured. The closest thing they have to a historical precedent for what we're proposing is. Is what? He looked up. It's not good for us. She stared at him. How long? The longest sustained resistance in their recorded history lasted 400 years. The empire that attempted the occupation no longer exists. The people being occupied do. Marin's crest went to a color 17th had never seen on her before. Something between gray and silver, not in any of the standard emotional registers. He would later learn it was the Vathai expression for "I have been operating on false information, and the correction is severe." Day 31, back at the table. Akafar was walking differently again. 17th had been watching him closely. The modifications, whatever they were clearly uncomfortable. They hadn't been designed for comfort. They'd been designed for function under duress. "I want to ask you something," 17th said, before the session formally opened. Vasquez looked at him. "Go ahead." "Mr. Akafar," he addressed the deputy directly, "the preparation process, is it painful?" Akafar was quiet for a moment. There was something in his expression that 17th was still learning to read. Humans had so many layers of expression happening simultaneously. "Yeah," he said finally, "it is." "And yet you volunteered." "Couldn't exactly ask 17,000 people to do something I wasn't willing to do myself." "That's," 17th stopped, reconsidered. "In our civilization, we have a principle. No authority figure should require of subordinates what they themselves would refuse, but you've extended that principle to include physical suffering." "We call it leading by example," Akafar said. "We call it," 17th said, "extraordinarily rare." Marin cleared her throat. "Shall we continue?" The Empire's revised proposal came on day 35. It was not the standard provisional protectorate agreement. The technological exchange cap had been adjusted. The intervention clause had been modified, not removed, but its trigger conditions were now significantly more specific, and it included a joint review mechanism with human representation. It was not what Vasquez had asked for. It was considerably better than what the Empire had originally offered. Vasquez read it for 2 days. "It's not enough," she said. Marin's crest went silver again. "Ambassador, we have made substantial concessions." "You've moved from a cage to a very large cage." Vasquez slid the proposal back across the table. "The joint review mechanism has imperial veto power. The technological exchange cap still exists, you've just raised it. The fundamental architecture of dependency is still in place. You still decide, ultimately, everything that matters." "You are a new species," Orison said, and his voice had finally lost its tone of patient condescension and picked up something more raw. "You have been spacefaring for decades. We have been spacefaring for millennia. Some asymmetry in governance is normal," Vasquez said. "For you, yes. For us," she paused, and what crossed her face was something 17th had come to recognize as *controlled grief. "We have a long history with asymmetric governance. It's called colonialism, and we are not going through it again." The silence after that lasted 40 seconds. 17th counted. It was Singh, the doctor, who broke it. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "should I tell them?" Vasquez closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "Yes." Singh looked at the Imperial delegation. The second phase of the Covenant Preparation Initiative began 6 days ago. Orison's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "How many volunteers?" 240,000, Singh said, "as of this morning." Here was what no one in the Empire had modeled. The signal on day 23, the one their ethical stance had declined to decrypt, had not been personal correspondence. It had been a broadcast, not to Earth's government, to Earth's population. Vasquez had, from the negotiating table, explained to every connected human being exactly what the Empire was offering and what Earth would lose if they accepted it. She had described the cage in plain language. She had described the alternatives. She had described the Covenant Preparation Initiative, and she had asked for volunteers, and she had been specific about what volunteering meant. 240,000 people had said yes within 6 days. The Empire's sociological models had assumed that a population told their negotiations might fail, that the alternative was physical modification, and the prospect of prolonged conflict would pressure their government to accept any deal available. Fear would force realism. The models had been built on rational actor assumptions, developed across 400 species. Humans were not irrational. That was the critical misunderstanding, the one that kept compounding. Every choice Vasquez had made was logical. Every choice the volunteers had made was logical, given their values, given what they'd decided mattered, given what they'd concluded was worth protecting. The logic was internally consistent. It was just *alien, and not in the way the Empire used that word. Day 41. The turning point came quietly, the way the most important things often do. Marin arrived at the table without her delegation. Just Marin, alone, no aides, her crest cycling through colors 17th had never catalogued, which he observed through the session room window before entering. When Vasquez walked in and saw Marin sitting alone, she stopped. "Where's your team?" Vasquez asked. "I sent them to file the wrong reports," Marin said. "I need to talk to you without this being a negotiation." Vasquez was still for a moment, then she turned to her own team. "Give us the room." After they left, Okafor last, with a look that communicated several things simultaneously to Vasquez, none of which 17th could fully interpret. The two women sat across from each other in a space designed for 12. The room seemed larger. "I've been reading your history," Marin said. "All of it. As much as I could process in 41 days. Marin's crest settled into a color 17th couldn't name. Not silver this time. Something warmer and harder simultaneously. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I'm asking as a person who is trying to understand, not as the representative of an empire." Vasquez nodded. "Do you want this to work?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "The negotiations. Do you want an agreement?" Or, Marin stopped, recalibrated, started again. "In your history, the 47 dates in your preamble, in a number of those cases the side being threatened continued escalating even when the other party offered terms, even when the terms were reasonable, because the conflict itself had become necessary, definitional. Is that—" she stopped again. "Are you negotiating for an agreement? Or are you negotiating to demonstrate that no acceptable agreement is possible? Because those are different things, and I haven't been able to determine which one is happening." The silence was long. "That's the most intelligent question anyone has asked me at this table," Vasquez said finally. "I need an answer." "I know." Vasquez looked at her hands, flat on the table, that gesture, the same one from the footage 12 years ago, needing to feel something solid. "Both," she said, "honestly. Both things are happening simultaneously and they're in tension with each other, and I don't think I could separate them even if I wanted to. We asterisk want an agreement. We want to be part of what you've built. We don't want the alternative. She looked up. But we've learned, at enormous cost, in ways that are still running in our history, that an agreement that doesn't treat us as genuinely equal isn't an agreement. It's a postponement. And the things that come after postponements are always worse than what we were trying to avoid. Marin's crest completed its color cycle and settled somewhere new, something between amber and gold. 17th had never seen that color on her before either. "If I go to the council," Marin said, "and I tell them I believe you will never sign the Protectorate Agreement in any form, what happens to your 240,000 volunteers?" "They finish the preparation process," Vasquez said. "And then we wait, and we hope you decide we're not worth it, and we spend the next however many years building as much capacity as we can. And if we decide you are worth it." Vasquez was quiet. "Then we find out whether your history is right that resistance is always eventually crushed, or whether ours is right that it's always eventually too expensive." She paused. "I know which history I trust." Marin stood. She was very still for a moment, her crest that gold-amber color. "I'm going to need 72 hours, she said. "We're not going anywhere." The council's emergency session lasted 59 hours. 17th filed 17 supplementary reports during that time, each one updating his analysis of human behavioral patterns. Each report made the previous one seem optimistic by comparison. The 47th date in the preamble, the most recent one, he'd finally traced it. 40 years ago. A small country facing annexation by a much larger neighbor. The annexing power had every conventional advantage. The conflict had lasted 19 years and ended not with military victory, but with the annexing power's internal political collapse, partly driven by the sustained cost of an occupation that refused to end. The smaller country still existed. The annexing government did not. And that was a conflict between asterisk humans, who shared biology, psychology, language roots, and cultural frameworks, who were capable of eventually exhausting and demoralizing each other in ways that led to resolution. The Empire had none of those shared frameworks with humanity, had no way to make humans feel the Empire's exhaustion, no cultural levers, no psychological common ground to exploit. They could win every battle. 17th was certain of that. He was no longer certain they could win the asterisk after. The Council's response arrived on hour 59. Marin read it alone before bringing it to the table. When she came back in, her crest was gold-amber again. "The Council," she said, "has authorized me to negotiate a mutual recognition treaty. The framework is," she paused, "substantially different from the Protectorate Agreement." Vasquez didn't react immediately. She looked at Marin for a long moment. "How different?" "Genuine joint governance body, equal legal standing in interstellar matters, technological exchange at a pace you set, not us. The intervention clause is removed entirely." "What do you get?" "Trade access, a formal ally," and Marin's crest shifted slightly, something complicated moving through it. "The Council's assessment is that having humanity inside the structure of imperial law is significantly preferable to the alternative." Akafor leaned forward. "What changed their minds?" Marin looked at him, at the way he was sitting, the careful management of his modified body's pain, the deliberate stillness that was its own kind of strength. 17th filed a report, she said. He calculated how long an occupation of Earth would last, assuming you achieved what the Covenant Preparation Initiative is designed to achieve. She paused. The lower bound of his estimate was 90 years. Akafor was quiet. The upper bound, Marin said, he listed as open-ended. The room was very still. He also noted, Marin continued, that the Council had made a categorical error in its initial assessment. We classified you as a species of moderate long-term potential, and assumed asterisk potential was the relevant variable. She looked at Vasquez directly. 17th argued that potential was irrelevant, that the relevant variable was something our classifications don't have a word for, something he described as the rate at which a species converts suffering into structural resolve. Singh made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. We have a word for it, Vasquez said. What is it? Stubbornness, she paused, or dignity depending on who you ask. The Mutual Recognition Treaty was signed 17 days later. It took 17 days because Vasquez read every line 17 times and renegotiated 8 clauses and added 3 new ones. Marin renegotiated back on 2 of them. 17th drafted compromise language that both sides accepted, and afterward felt something he didn't have a clean name for, the Vathai equivalent of intellectual vertigo, the sensation of having had a foundational assumption restructured without warning. The signing ceremony was small. Both sides had agreed against spectacle. Vasquez signed with a pen. Marin used an imperial light seal. The document, the final one, was printed on standard imperial substrate, not plant fiber, not this time. But in the upper right corner of the first page, pressed carefully before the signing, was a human thumbprint. The same one from the first day. 17th looked at it for a long moment before the ceremony began. He turned to Vasquez. The same document. The same covenant, she said, different ending. You knew, he said, when you walked in on the first day. You knew what the Empire would offer and you knew you wouldn't accept it. I knew what you'd offer because powerful parties always start from the same position. She was watching the final preparations being made. I didn't know how you'd respond. I've spent 60 days finding out. And if we hadn't responded the way we did. She was quiet for a moment. Akafar, standing beside her, was watching the same preparations, his hands very still at his sides. Then 240,000 people would have finished what they started, she said, and we'd have found out together what that meant. Were you frightened? She turned and looked at him fully then, that direct eye contact that still startled him. Something moved through her expression, something real and unmanaged, the kind of thing that slipped through when people stopped performing and started simply being. Every single day, she said. The news spread through the Empire over the following weeks. Not all of it was accurate. Most of the versions that circulated among the general imperial population simplified the story into something cleaner. A small species that stood firm, an empire that recognized wisdom and relented, a treaty that expanded civilization's borders elegantly. 17th's internal report, the one that had actually changed the Council's decision, was classified. But some of it leaked, it always does. The line that circulated most widely wasn't his analysis of occupation timelines. It wasn't his reclassification of humanity's strategic category. It was a single sentence from his executive summary, which he had written at 4 in the morning after 37 straight hours of archive research, and which he had not expected anyone outside the Council to read. These beings are not dangerous because they are powerful. They are dangerous because they have decided, at a civilizational level, that there is no amount of cost at which their dignity becomes optional. 17 ambassadorial delegations from systems that had signed the standard protectorate agreement in previous decades requested copies of the Mutual Recognition Treaty within 6 months. 4 of them were renegotiated within a year. The Council did not acknowledge a connection between these events and the human negotiations. Officially, there was no connection to acknowledge. Unofficially, Marin told 17th something over a private comm channel, many months later, that he spent a long time sitting with. I've been doing this for 130 years, she said. I have never been in a room with someone who was genuinely prepared to lose and still believed it was worth it. Most people, most species, when they say they're willing to sacrifice, they mean they're willing to sacrifice until it hurts too much. She wasn't saying that. What was she saying? She was saying, Marin started again. There's a human concept. I've been trying to translate it properly for months. The closest I can get in standard imperial is something like, the cost is not a reason to stop. The cost is evidence that the thing is real. 17th thought about the thumbprint, the blood that was not symbolic, the 17,000 and then the 240,000. The doctor who sat at the table the day it mattered most. The deputy who walked through pain every day and would not pretend he didn't. Is that wisdom, he asked, or is it something else? I've been in contact with Vasquez periodically, Marin said. I asked her the same question. What did she say? A pause. She said, ask me in 100 years. We're just getting started. Somewhere in the archives of the Galactic Empire, filed under human sociological anomalies, working classification, pending, there is a record of the 68 days between first contact and the Mutual Recognition Treaty. It is flagged for mandatory review by all first contact diplomatic teams. It contains 17 supplementary reports, a complete archive of the negotiating sessions, medical data from the Covenant Preparation Initiative, and 17th's executive summary. At the very end of the file, after all the analysis and projection models and reclassification proposals, there is a single addendum. It was added 6 months after the treaty signing by 17th himself, and it contains no data. It contains one question. If a species voluntarily undergoes physical suffering to make a philosophical point about dignity, and then, having made the point, immediately asks what they can build together, what exactly is the correct taxonomic classification for that? The answer field is blank. It has been blank for 11 years. Every analyst who opens the file reads the question. Some of them spend a long time on it. None of them have filled in the field. Because the honest answer, the one that keeps suggesting itself and keeps getting set aside for being too large for a database entry, is that there may not be a classification. That humanity may have walked into the galaxy representing something the galaxy's existing categories weren't built to contain. Not a threat, not an ally, not a curiosity. Something older than the Empire's language for it. Something that had been forged in 400 years of refusing to stop. Something that looked from the outside like stubbornness. Something that felt from the inside like the only thing worth being.